Hi everyone, I'm Stef. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Avo. Thank you for joining us on day 2 of DevGuild from Heavybit. I am incredibly excited to moderate this panel of powerhouses that have extensive experience with going to market and building repeatable revenue machines, which is the theme of this panel. First of all, we are here to learn and to try to extract as much knowledge as we can from these incredible people. We will focus particularly on how teams with bottom-up approaches to go-to-market have built these repeatable revenue machines. Today with us, we have 3 people that have that experience from quite different angles. There are definitely themes to it. Like we already talked about, the bottom-up motion, but they are all very unique. Every go-to-market motion is different from the other because you have all monetized bottom-up. Can you tell us a little bit, sort of just who you are, where you come from, and what your monetization model looks like in practice? We'll start with Amanda, please.
Hi, Stef. I'm Amanda Kleha, and I'm the Chief Customer Officer at Figma. I oversee aspects of our go-to-market strategy, including marketing, self-service sales, as well as customer support. A little bit about Figma. We are a web-based design platform for teams that build products together. Teams like Microsoft, Notion, New York Times, to name a couple people who use us. And they use it for every part of the product development process, from brainstorming to design to even build. So it's an end-to-end platform that you can build on. And our go-to-market motion includes a self-service model where you can come try the product for free. You can upgrade with a credit card on your own if you wish. And then we also have a sales team that helps sell as well. So we have a freemium, self-service, and sales motion all together, and they work together. And part of why I was attracted to working at Figma.
Excellent. Thank you, Amanda. Over to Chris, please.
Hi, I'm Chris Bach. I'm a co-founder of Netlify. It's a platform that web developers use to build, scale, and maintain web projects. And we're here because we saw that there was a new architecture for the web, and where you would decouple all the web layers from the business logic on the back end. And that would need a viable workflow to work with that at scale and a way to tie it all together on an orchestration layer, if you will. And that's what we built out Netlify. And we were about 1 million developers last year. Now we passed 2.4. So it's growing really fast. The category is growing really fast as well. We software as a service, of course. We have a generous free tier. We have self-service plans, and then of course we have a lot of enterprises that run on us, and we run mission critical apps such as Twilio, a $60 billion market cap company that has that the actual core product, the logged in web console is a Netlify application. Spring just moved over 6.5 million storefronts to Netlify, and so on. And what's unique about it compared to legacy platforms of the past is that this is a very wide agnostic platform. So rather than be specialized in e-commerce or certain use cases, because of this separation, what we're seeing is that it really caters anything you build for the web, whether it's a e-commerce or .com or marketing sites, or even like kiosks down in the restaurants with all the menus are running. There used to be some .NET server running on a Windows NT computer over in the corner. They're now all sort of becoming parts of the same workflows, and that's what sort of Netlify is championing, and actually working very closely with both Figma and Apollo that's here today. And it's a lot of fun to be part of the new web economy.
Nice. Thank you for sharing, Chris. Over to you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Stef. I'm Matt DeBergalis. I'm the co-founder and CTO at Apollo GraphQL. We're an open source company, so our bottom-up motion is about helping developers adopt a graph instead of the traditional way of connecting clients and servers with point-to-point APIs. GraphQL allows teams to write queries instead of code. And for a developer, it's a night and day difference in experience. You can have better tools, you move faster, all the benefits of a modern tech stack. For a company, the benefit is how do we ship more software more quickly, and how do we adapt to a changing market? If you're in retail or if you're in media, it's a race to be one of the top companies in your category from a digital experience point of view. And the ability to do that quickly and to do that with changing market conditions and opportunities, to be able to take teams of developers and rapidly create new data-rich customer experiences and get those on the mobile device, on the desktop, on the kiosks. All of that is the difference between being really successful in the modern era and being a laggard. So for us, we've really had to build two things. We've had to build a bottom-up motion that's really fundamentally about developers and open source and this mega trend of moving away from the old way of doing things to the graph. But we've also had to build a motion around the strategic implications of that for larger companies. If you're shopping at Walmart, you're on Apollo. If you're watching stuff on Netflix, you're using a graph. If you're reading the New York Times, you're using a graph. These are strategic decisions that require a lot of thought about how you take that bottom up motion and translate it into something that spreads across the company. And there's a lot inside that.
Right, exactly. Thank you for sharing, Matt. There's so much to unpack in everything, and just your intros already. So today we would love to cover, for example, how intentional, like how on track have you stayed with your revenue model, for example? Like, did you always intend to build a bottom-up company? And I think there's a lot to unpack also in, and we'll talk about like persona discovery and all that stuff. I want to just start immediately with this. Like, did you always intend to build a bottom-up company? And why or why not?
Yes, we always did. I mean, what we saw was there was a better way to build for the web, right? The web was in danger of going into walled gardens and losing out to proprietary app stores, and it because of the underlying architecture wasn't good enough, right? And so we saw that there was a way for the web to be many times faster, more performant, more secure, more scalable, and much more compatible with modern Git workflows and the workflows that we're hearing about here. But it would require this viable workflow. And so Netlify essentially bet everything on a market trend that simply didn't exist. And so the only way for us to succeed is if there's a massive adoption of this, if it becomes, as it is becoming now, synonymous with how you build for the web in the first place. And so it only becomes relevant for us if we only able to create a really meaningful business if we get into the hands of millions. So it had to be a bottom up. And it starts there. It starts with the hobby projects, right? And then you grow, and they take you into enterprises and so on, right? But yeah, in our case, there was no doubt at any point. It had to be bottoms up.
Okay, awesome. I would love to hear from Matt on this next, because I know you just mentioned like sort of Chris, you just talked about the trajectory from, having the mass and then going into the enterprise, and Matt had already touched on that a little bit. Matt, can you share your take on that, your intention,
Yeah.
bottom up?
I mean, same. It was always going to be bottom up, and I've been a fan of open source since I was a kid. So I think it's the best way to spread the best technology to the most people, and to make that technology, particularly infrastructure, the kinds of stuff that benefits from thousands of hands improving it day over day. And I think it's 2021. Every company has to be a software company. And I think we would all agree that the tools that a software company is going to use are going to be tools that the developers pick, or the designers or the product managers. But like that's the motion. And so I think it's not just about scale. I think it's even maybe more fundamental that it's hard to see a different path, whether it's a cloud-based offering or an open source offering. It's got to be something that developers are going to pick, that it's easy to get started with, that you've got an early win or an aha moment or some kind of sort of magical experience that really clicks for people and makes them want to do more and makes it a sticky experience for us. And, I think a lot of these ideas they make the most sense when they spread to a market that's essentially every company. And so I think you have to have a strategy for how that's going to work. You can't hire enough salespeople to sell into every single company, really. And you need a way to make the economics work, not just as a startup at a small scale, but even at the largest of scales, where I think the benefits of that bottoms up motion are in some ways the strongest.
Excellent. As a follow-up after these answers, I want to talk about that sort of motion of turning the bottom-up leads into actual revenue and turning people into paying customers. But Amanda, I would love to hear your thoughts on that as well from Figma or other stories if you have them.
Yeah, absolutely. So the founders, when they were first building Figma, wanted to get some feedback from potential users. And what they did was they looked at who do we want to have as our users? And so they made a short list of people that they wanted to go show the product to. And I'm sure most founders do this, but what I think is unique about the story is that because it was the first browser-based design tool, it was new, and people weren't used to not having a native app, and so they got a lot of feedback that was like, "Oh, well, this is interesting, but it needs a lot of other things in it." And so, what I like about the story is that they went back and built those things, but then went back to those same potential users and showed them like, hey, we listened to you and we built this. And I think that that second part is what a lot of founders maybe get distracted in not doing. But they really won over the hearts of some early influencers and had a bottoms up motion in mind the whole time, because they wanted to make the mission and vision of the company is to make design accessible to all. And with that kind of mission, you can't create a company where it requires a sales team to sell. So launched a freemium version of the product at first. And I'm a big believer that if you're going to have self-service and sales, you have to start with self-service, because it creates the right DNA in your company to figure out not only what's the product you're building, but what's the experience of understanding and educating your users about that product. And that in itself is its own product to build. And you have to do that up front. Otherwise, it's very difficult to engineer later in your business. So that's what we did at Figma.
Awesome. Very well. Exactly. And it's been particularly interesting, obviously. So one of the things we have sort of, everyone talks about sort of Slack as the first, or as a really strong example of a bottom-up motion, but that applies to sort of everyone in the company using that solution, versus all of the companies that are here on this call. It's a different thing. It's a specific persona to solve a specific work problem that's not just general communications for all the team. And I think on this sort of note of identifying how you can turn the mass, the bottom that sort of adopts your product into a buying persona, can you talk a little bit about that journey of when you have started realizing that you have some pull, how do you then start turning those people into actual paying customers? Matt, maybe going over to you.
Yeah, this question was one of the big struggles and challenges for us. We understood pretty early on, I think, the persona of the developer that was going to adopt Apollo, make the switch to GraphQL. We understood the benefits. We went through a lot of the things that we've talked about, where you watch people using it, you ask questions. The first killer feature of Apollo is that we took pull requests. You get that feedback loop pretty early on. But what we found is that the buyer is very different. And the early instinct that I had,
the buyer is very different from the adopter.
Yeah, the instinct I had initially was, we would serve the needs of the developer, and at some point we'd find some features for which the developers or the developer teams would pay. And it turns out if you're in that conversation, you're having a pretty tactical conversation about specific features that a developer or a manager values. And the problem isn't that a manager has one credit card limit and a director has another credit card limit and a VP has another credit card limit. The problem is like what the VP wants is completely different, like unrelated in a lot of ways to what that manager or the developer might want. And if you go to the VP and you try to have a conversation about the tactical stuff that's important to make that product-led growth and the bottom-up journey work for the developer, it doesn't get you very far. So, what we found is we really needed to understand two personas pretty early on for this to work. And that second persona is when we think about how we do marketing, for example, there's a whole set of things we do for the buyer persona that connects to what we might do for the developer persona. The way Apollo works is that as part of my team at Apollo, we have a DevRel team and a developer experience team. And that's the group that actually does a lot of the content that's really designed for the developer persona, right? That team owns the documentation, the blog, a lot of the kind of communication we do at that level. And then we have a marketing team, and a lot of the work they do, whether it's case studies or content that's designed for the buyer, is really, it's a different value prop and a different message, and it's designed to drive a different kind of conversation toward the sale. And for us, once we figured out what that looked like, it made things a lot easier. But that's where maybe I'm an engineer by trade. The instincts and the intuition that maybe serves me well from a product design point of view served me less well in that go-to-market space. And we found that we had to really look very carefully at that whole journey that ends at the purchase to really understand that.
That is awesome. That is immediately sparking questions around team structure, because you talked about two different teams owning that. So I would love to double click on sort of how you've built your go-to-market teams as well from person one and then onwards. Amanda, I would like to throw the ball over to you. Where are you in the world? So I know where to throw the ball. Sorry.
I'm in San Francisco.
Right. So over from Iceland to San Francisco.
I love it.
A little bit about sort of that, because you talked about the user journey and the product-led growth. And I really agree, you have to, if you're going to try to make sure that the adoption of the mass of the company is going to be the driver for the big deal, then that big mass within that company, within the buying company, they have to have a really pleasant experience. So can you talk a little bit about sort of your learnings on that, building that product-led experience? How did you identify the things that were maybe triggers for turning people into paying customers and things like that?
Yeah, I think, to Matt's earlier point, today's tools are often chosen by developers, by designers, by product people. And so we're in that space where we knew that we had a bottoms up motion to execute on, but early on we had enterprise sized companies wanting to use Figma. And so it's easy to have a single developer sign up and maybe get some colleagues to start using it. But very quickly, if those developer or designers are excited to use Figma broadly at a company, they will start doing some internal selling on behalf of us, which is fantastic. But you get IT involved and they have some security questions. And now you have a legal requirements on your go-to-market motion that is not a bottoms-up kind of conversation. So that's how that happens real quick. And but I think for us, a design platform, you think it's just designers using it, but the product itself, what's beautiful about it is you can use it really easily with other people. And so in fact, 2/3 of our users are people who collaborate with designers. They're developers, they're marketers, they're product managers, they're researchers. And so we have designed the product to make it very seamless to share files, to incorporate other people into your projects. And as a result, even though the designer is the initial user, it very quickly has other personas using the product and other people involved in the process. So we will often, at large companies, because you no longer have a centralized design team, but rather design teams that are within business units or within product lines, will land in one team, grow there, and then we'll expand to other teams. And when you're working with enterprise-sized companies, they want to have the security conversations, they want to have the legal conversations. They want to talk to sales. You might think that people don't want to talk to sales, but they actually do in many cases. And so if you're a company that hires salespeople that know how to talk to your personas and users, that's okay. That's not a scary thing to have sales. So yeah, when I joined 3 years ago, we already had a couple salespeople because we were already selling to enterprise-sized companies.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, exactly. I mean, what they want is like they want someone to help you navigate the legal and security processes. It's like, please, I don't want to do this on my own. Help me. But maybe like, can you talk about the sort of the data that you might be using for sort of identifying those sales opportunities? Are they mostly when the internal teams ask to talk to sales, or like how do you use also qualitative or quantitative data to trigger, an upsell motion?
We absolutely have a lot of people who fill out a form on our website because they want to talk to sales. So we pass those on to sales right away. But then of the people that sign up for Figma, we do a bunch of segmentation, enriching those leads in all the classic ways you would do that on the demographic side, on the product usage side. So we determine if some of those might get passed to sales right away, or do we wait and see how they grow a bit before we pass them to sales. So there's a whole kind of decision tree that happens on the back end to determine that. But it's based on product as well as the demographic profile.
Mm-hmm. I'm excited to double click on that. And also you were touching on that, Matt, in an earlier conversation with, account-based sales and things like that. But before that, just quickly over to you, Chris, where are you in the world?
I'm also in San Francisco.
Right. So maybe Amanda can take the ball and just throw it over to you.
That's not as far as Fro is from Iceland.
No, it's not as far. So it won't take long for the ball to arrive. But can you talk a little bit about that, sort of how you turn your bottom-up motion into opportunities and into revenue, and what that journey looks like?
Absolutely, right. I mean, so like very much echoing also Amanda, like that. There's a lot of that applies directly to Netlify as well, right? And there's differences between Netlify is a very broad platform. We go from local development all the way to a global multi-cloud edge network. And we'll have tons of code schools using us because you can deploy a web project in seconds. Like success is very immediate. But we also have very big enterprises. And of course, they want to hear about security and compliance and so on. And I believe in our case, we don't see, there are different needs, but it's very important to be aware of how one feeds into the other. Otherwise, I think it's very hard to have two. Like then it's a dual funnel motion, right? And that to us is a little hard. And so we look at a bunch of different things, but we've never been interested in trying to monetize the individual developer. That's not the point. Like if there was a magic button to never have to do that, we'd have pressed it a long time ago. But there's different kinds of usage, right? Both in volume and in advanced feature sets and so on, right? And what kind of usage is it for? Who's the client, the demographics? I mean, there's so many things that plays into this, right? I would also say that modern sales, I think is for a while it's been like always not always be closing, but always be helping, right? And I think that if you instrument your product in the right way, these people will graduate to want the help, and then they receive it from you, right? And it's a collaboration. And there's, as long as you make sure that it's a fair value exchange, right, then it continues to be so. And I think that's super important to always strive for. And we look at a multitude of different things when it comes to knowing when to reach out. And again, just like at Figma's case, right, a lot of them will reach out to us because that's how the product uses this instrument. And you want to talk about security and compliance, right? Or you want saying, hey, like we want to make sure that we have dedicated build environments or whatever it might be, because of the kinds of accounts that we're moving to. Or we just want control. We want more insight. We started with one team. Now we have 20 teams, right? And hundreds of developers. We need to consolidate, right? So yeah, more than one way.
Thank you all. Thank you all for sharing. I love the always be helping. I totally relate to that. That is just, and that feeling when you're able to, you were talking about it, Amanda, with like just rapid feedback, just, show people that you are listening and that you will keep delivering, and sort of, deliver into the product the things that, or fix the things that are broken, and just make the things better that people really want. And I also love one thing, which is, we try to have it as a policy. When people ask us questions and they didn't find the answer in the documentation, then update the docs and share that docs link with them. I think that's a really powerful thing as a sort of just a mindset for the company, to frame how important good documentation is, really. But we've talked a lot about how we turn the mass into revenue, but can we talk a little bit about the top of funnel? Early, what were your first inbound channels, and how did you figure them out? And what did you do once you figured those things out? Anything from community to sort of product marketing to creating the right content. And it sounds like, Matt, you, for example, mentioned earlier that you now have different teams that are creating different content for different purposes, like for the leader versus for the developer. But can you talk a little bit about sort of that top of funnel and like the inbound channels?
So our top of funnel initially was the open source developer adoption, and do you market to developers sort of in the classic way? Of course not. It's I think documentation is the best marketing content there is. To your point a second ago, you've got forums, you've got events, you've got all the things that developers really gravitate to. I think video is the next big frontier on this, and we're starting to put a bigger and bigger investment into shorter form video content for developers. That leads to open source adoption. That leads to all the great things that ultimately culminate in somebody's using this thing for something they care about. And one thing we found was sometimes they call you and they want to buy. It's not even clear why they want to buy. They're not even sure why they want to buy. And you can have some success there early on, but we had some examples where teams using Apollo, they reach out to us. We think it's a good sales signal. Maybe they even filled out the contact sales form. And it turns out they're pretty happy. And yeah, you can build a feature at some point in your SaaS. We have a SaaS element to Apollo. And so, there's a sale there, but the enterpriseability stuff, what we found is sometimes didn't actually resonate with the team that's using it, right? They're happy. It's a good product. They had a question or two, but hey, doesn't your boss want you using single sign-on? I don't think so. Well, should you ask him? No, I don't want to talk to my boss about this. My boss doesn't know I'm using this stuff. Like and suddenly you're pushing on rope. And so for the first, however long it was, we were really, it was all inbound, and we were talking to people that were already using the product. And it's kind of one of those things where, like, if they're happy, you have one problem, and if they're not happy, you have an even bigger problem. And what we found was the big shift for us was we don't necessarily need to go through or want to go through the team that's using it to have the real sales conversation. And so we have this whole other funnel, really. And when we built marketing at Apollo, which is a much newer function than the product in DevRel that I was talking about, that's really more about what are the signals about the companies that are using this stuff. And some of that can come from our product, but a lot of that, maybe signals about events they're attending or job posts that they're putting up, or any information we can gather that shows us what the scale of graph adoption might be in the company. Because we have this sort of thesis that every company is going to need a graph. That's going to come from a bottom-up initial desire for the graph, but that's a strategic decision. And it was mentioned earlier, like sales has a role to play. And a big part of what enterprise sales really does is help people navigate multi-stakeholder strategic decisions across a company. And so there's this sort of second funnel almost where we can think about having a conversation with the right person, finding the right champion to help us have that conversation. We're not trying to do this with anybody that's not using Apollo. So there's always part of this where we can say, and guess what? Your teams are already doing this, and here's the value they're getting, or here's what they've found. And now they do want to have the discussion about ilities. It's like, wait, I've got how many teams doing what? And I can't see all that in one place, or that is completely contrary to our policy around how security is going to work, for example. And I think security for all of us is probably a big driver of the enterprise SKU. So that's the thing that took more sort of creativity for us, and that's what unlocked a lot of the interesting things. And I'll say one other thing on that point, which is for a lot of us, I think PLG is attractive because it's got a certain incremental character to it, right? You have happy users. Let's go get some more. Let's add a product feature that drives additional growth, or a viral element, or a sharing element. I love the way you can share designs in Figma, and that's certainly how I first learned about it. Is some designer put a URL in front of me, and I was like, "This is cool. How do they do that in the browser?" And that's great because you can kind of feather in as much investment or as much time as you have. The top-down piece, what we found is like you really need all the pieces in place for it to work. You can't muddle your way into a strategic conversation for an enterprise sale with a larger company. You've got to have legal, you've got to have the account execs, you've got to have sales engineering, you've got to have a certain element of success in place. All these parts have to be talking to each other, and that's there's just a lot more intricacy to that. It's less of an intuitive thing. We found we needed to really, until we had all those pieces in place, it's harder to see the results of that. So it takes a certain, I think, and maybe a message I'd have for the viewers is if you have the instinct that there's going to be an enterprise motion or a top-down motion, like think, kind of from the beginning about what that looks like. I think it's true. I think Amanda said, like, if you don't have PLG early on in your DNA, you're going to struggle to get it later. I 100% agree with that. I would also say, though, if you're not thinking from the beginning about the monetization, and you don't have in your DNA the understanding of what it's going to look like to really have these strategic conversations, if that's part of your motion, that also is a wrenching cultural change. And I think the earlier you can sort of think about all that fitting together, the better.
Thank you so much, Matt. I think that's a good trigger to throw the ball over to Amanda. Where are you in the world, Matt, you said?
I'm also in San Francisco. Rumors of its demise
All
are,
right.
I think,
short
overcooked.
journey there. All right. But I want to, as a trigger to your discussion, Amanda, about this, the inbound channels, I would love to hear a little bit about the inbound channels from you as well. Mm-hmm. But there are things to double click on also in what Matt was saying. You have to have both DNAs in your DNA. And it's interesting to talk about sort of with PLG, how can you build a muscle of a PLG where you are where you have the right data to identify your revenue strategy as well, and how you're going to price your product based on your learnings of the PLG, and based on sort of, Matt, you touched a little bit on, like, there are some people that go and reach out to sales for something. Is there something in your PLG learnings that helped you learn things about your pricing strategy as well? So can you sort of go a little bit into the inbound and then sort of into PLG and sort of that input as a pricing strategy for the bigger revenue streams in the company?
Sure, sure. So early on, there was a lot of community aspects to how we thought about inbound. So, well, I should say, first and foremost, it was about building a great product that people wanted to use. And I know that's obvious, but like if that's not where you're laser focused at the start, like it's just not going to happen after that. So building a great product, but then also building in that spread through the product was key for Figma. So being able to really easily share files with other people in the browser. A lot of our inbound signups are from people that have been invited into a Figma file. So that's key. So the product drives a ton of inbound. You can also post your own Figma files, and those drive organic traffic for us as well. So we did a lot on the SEO organic side early on. And then community. So many customers early on didn't want to necessarily share that they were a Figma customer, but because we invested in social channels and creating relationships on social channels publicly with many of our end users, I could show proof points of many companies using Figma because their end users are talking about it online, even though the company PR department doesn't want us to use their logo. But I think you need those early proof points and case studies, but you can get them in different ways. You don't have to write a case study for it necessarily. So those were maybe different elements of the early days thinking. It certainly wasn't advertising. I'll tell you that. We do some advertising now, but that wasn't early on where we were focused.
And how did you build that team? Like, who was the first person to start building out a community? Who was the first person who that started obsessing over people posting on Twitter and things like that?
Yeah, the first person hired was a marketing generalist who was passionate about the design community and could be an overall athlete and do a lot of different things. And then we also hired a design advocate or evangelist who had actually had a podcast himself and had a lot of connections into the design influencer world. And so we would create content like live streams where we would invite people to use the product together and show it off in kind of fun game formats. So I was thinking about how do you create the opportunity for people to see your product and be involved in it, and without a lot of commitment to it. It was more in a fun way. So we did that. And so there was community building by hiring someone in the community to be part of it. And I think what was important was that person was really honest about what was exciting about the product, but also maybe what wasn't quite there yet with the product, because it set a tone of this company is really authentic about their building of something, and they're going to display the truth about where they are in the process of building a new experience that's exciting and it's going to change the way we work. So that was key to just the brand in general. Yeah. But as far as your second part of your question, which was about pricing.
Yeah, and sort of product-led triggers for deciding, for example, cutoff points. You get access to this if you subscribe or things like that.
You yourself can sign up for Figma and start using it as an individual today. Where we ended up putting a pay gate was if you, I should say the magic moment is when you use it with other people, because then you see how it's different and the real value prop behind the product. And so it was important to us that you can experience that on the free plan. So you get a taste of it, and then we want you to upgrade to a paid plan because you want to repeat that process multiple times. So you have to, as you're thinking about pricing, figure out what is that magic moment. How can I incorporate a taste of it in my free offering, and then have people upgrade when they want to repeat it over and over again. So that's how we thought about the packaging of it. Pricing wise, I think that sort of depends on what you're selling, willingness to pay, your competitive dynamics. So all of those kind of inputs go into it. I know that when I joined, we had one paid plan, and we had another one in beta that was more like the enterprise tier. And we had many customers on that enterprise tier in beta, and we just talked to them about their willingness to pay. So they played a role in helping us determine where we should price it as far as that goes.
Right. So qualitative was more of a governing factor than quantitative data in that. Is that what you're saying?
For us, I yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for sharing, Amanda.
Yeah.
So over to you, Chris. Can you talk about your inbound channels and because it's interesting. What's interesting about Figma, obviously, is that you as a designer, you are sharing visual things all the time, but you're not necessarily sharing your deployment system or but on
That's
Twitter,
true.
I guess, I don't know.
But again, like we were trying to push forward a new architecture for the web, right? So I think the beginnings, you have to try to define what does that mean? Like, what is that, right? And who's the key players and trendsetters, and where would you draw an invisible line, and then interact with those people. And one of the things we saw was that early on, a lot of the innovation was coming from site generators. And so we, for example, created staticgen.com, which was the largest open source directory in the world for site generators. And that also gave us access to a lot of those creators and contributors, so we could start the conversations there. That also meant that it was easier for us to figure out, just by being able to measure the popularity of those, right, by GitHub stars and so on, which ones that we would interact with the most and write tutorials around and so on, right? And so I think if you're early in a space, where you're king of a hill, but it's a very small hill, rather than having a small sliver of a large pie. If that's your approach, then something like building out these resources makes a lot of sense, because it don't take a lot of resources, and you're going to it's going to be a lot harder later on, right? Because all of a sudden, it is a big category, and getting the SEO to have this prominent is going to be a lot harder. So doing some of those things early on can help. And the other thing was that the first 10 people we hired, they all had a developer advocate in their contract. I mean, in the way that we don't advertise, we demonstrate the product, right? By you qualify it by showing how it integrates with other parts of the ecosystem and so on. And so it's not because everyone has to stand on a stage, but it's setting the tone that, hey, we build it and then we talk about it. And the first advocate we got was someone that we had just seen in the space, and he was learning. Again, this was all nascent, right? But he was good at talking about it and blogging about what he was learning as he went along. And we thought, hey, that would be great, right? Someone that's going to be helping building out Netlify, right? And the early audience would have to say, well, how do I even start here? Like, what's the step 1, 2, 3? And he would share his own journey there, right? And that resonated a lot. And developer experience has always been extremely important for us, right? Of course, we do some marketing and enterprise marketing and so on, right? But very much this organic approach in creating concentric circles in the water from demonstrating the product in itself, right, and the value and the partnerships, right, the ecosystem, getting them involved, right, and making sure that it's a win-win for all, and they will preach you and vice versa has been incredibly important for us.
So this is really valuable insights. So you're saying like, and there's a lot of talk about community right now. And I mean, Matt, you didn't specifically talk about sort of how you originally get people to adopt, the open source product, but you mentioned like documentation and things like that. But ultimately, they have to discover it somehow. But Amanda and Chris, you both talked about community building pretty clearly.
Very much so. I mean, Netlify has we just recently announced our latest fundraiser, and as part of that, we're creating a fund where we set aside and are planning to invest $10 million into the ecosystem and have a program attached to it. because that's how much it means to us, right? This idea that if we're going to be a conduit of an ecosystem, if we're an orchestration layer, then we're nowhere without the ecosystem maturing alongside with us, right? So it is incredibly important. It remains for us to be it. And I don't think I've ever been in an enterprise call with someone where there isn't someone that says, I just wanted to say that I've been using Netlify for my personal projects for years, and I absolutely love it, right? I mean, we have the champion inside is incredibly important for us and remains so, right?
Mm-hmm. Did I understand correctly that every person, independent of a role, like 10 people, the first 10 people you hired them for a role, but you also included a developer advocate in their contract?
It was part of the contract.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That's awesome. I'm stealing that. That's awesome. So we're sort of, we are very close to time, but I do want to talk a little bit about identifying personas. It is just such a crucial part of building your product and company early on. Amanda and Chris, you both mentioned sort of finding the cool kids in the space, and sort of I once had a conversation with the Docker founder, and he said this, like, developers are like most people. You just have to find the coolest developer that wears the leather jacket and have them put on your leather jacket, and then all of the other developers also want to put on that leather jacket, which is hilarious. But identifying those sort of early personas, how did you identify your first personas? Have you gone through any struggles in identifying them? Have you sort of switched a little bit? Have they been pretty consistent? Would just love to throw that over there as an open-ended question. And identifying those, how much of a mix was that of qualitative and quantitative sort of data research? Over to you, Amanda, maybe start there.
Yeah, I think that the target initial personas tended to be people who were either very passionate about a particular design topic. They were maybe public with their thoughts on that and were prolific online, and we could find that through data. Or they worked at design forward companies. And so they wanted it's basically finding the first adopters in your persona group. And they often are the ones that are the most vocal. And so that's who we targeted first. I think over time, we've been able to attract people beyond that audience because you get a critical mass and all of a sudden, like, oh, it sounds like everyone's using Figma. What's wrong with me? I better go check it out. And so how do you get to that point is just first winning those first adopters, for sure.
I got a great story about Figma today. We were talking about, there's a moment when you've been speaking a language for such a long time that you start dreaming in that language. And someone was talking about, there was a moment where I realized I'd become a Figma power user when I started applying Figma keyboard shortcuts into like Sketch or something like that. They're like, okay, it's happening.
I like that.
Yeah, it's a good one. But you mentioned like you found them because they were vocal. So that's sort of qualitative. Were you able to feed that back into sort of analytics, product analytics, and to identify then personas in another way through quantitative data?
I think quantitatively more so on just who is active online and how broad is their circle of influence. Like there was a lot of quantitative research that went into that, and then McKinsey even has like a study on design forward companies and are they more successful than companies that aren't. So there's like research that you can tap into like that to come up with who might be good lists. And so that played a role as well.
I didn't think, very early on, it was a little different, right? Because there was sort of saying, okay, if this is the category, who are the ones that we can't do without? Like, what are the key players here, right? And are they founders or are they just very active on the seat, speaking about it and seeing, do we have a shared vision, right? Are they also talking about the same things? Are they going to be likely to understand what it is? And it was part of the product market fit exercise, right? You want to get in front of them and show them something. And if half of them think that this is not a good idea, they don't see the immediate value of it, you should go back to the drawing board, because if anyone, they should be able to get it. And funnily enough, like 3 or 4 of those 20 original on a paper work for us now, right? And another 3 or 4 are angel investors. So it's funny to look back on. I say, as you go in today, like we have millions of people using the platform, right? And there you look a lot more about at how they use it, right? And there's a ton of features like advanced language-based redirects, right? You don't really need that for personal blog. So that's a good indicator that's someone that might have a user of Netlify where it makes more sense to engage in conversation and so on, right? But early on, I think it was very qualitatively, right? It was very much talking about what are the shifts in the mechanics and how do you buy it? Why do you buy it? What could you be doing instead? What's the overhead that you're aware of? What's the overhead that you're not aware of? And what does that mean for where we fit in, and what are our dependencies, and all those things really happened from hundreds of conversations with people that we found relevant in the space, and not so much from looking at large data in our case, right? And I think it's often the case when you're starting out, then the data becomes incredibly important as you start moving along, right? Even though today we still have some of the largest servers online around web usage and so on, right? That helps us helps us with product roadmap decisions, and we have events and talk to clients and so on, right? But of course, quantitative data also takes up a big space now.
Yeah, exactly. Anything from you on that, Matt? You've already talked a bit about it.
Yeah, I agree. I think early on it's got to be qualitative, and it's got to be based on a view of who the product's really for and what it solves. I mean, the big thing I'd say is developers is a pretty broad brush, and I don't think developer is a very good persona. You probably want something a little bit more nuanced than that. And what we've found, and I think this probably connects to the Netlify world and Jamstack and the Figma world too, is I think the future is app devs. I think a lot of the technology stack historically was built by and for backend developers. And you had, AWS, you've got all the cloud native stuff. You've got every API in the history of the world was really designed by the backend teams. And, the reason GraphQL spread so quickly is it's the first API anybody thought to make that was good for a front-end developer. And if you learn about product engineers, you find they're very different in a lot of ways. The culture and the values are really different. They don't wear leather jackets the same way that like the Docker people did. You know what I mean? And the whole move fast and break things thing from Facebook is a piece of this. I think there's a really interesting cultural shift. And when I was in school, I thought, oh, the cool technology's on the back end, but my view has come around to like, it's the app devs that make the cool stuff. That's where the value is. It's the companies with great app devs and great apps that are the companies we all respect and admire now. And yeah, they have great backend systems too, but I think there's a big shift in the dynamic. And I think the thing that really for us kind of unlocked this insight was to start really trying to understand a growing number of developers whose needs hadn't been met with the kind of old way of thinking about this, and not just the product, but like how you price things, what support looks like. Everything changes on this dynamic, and my hunch is that a lot of the next generation of companies and products and a lot of the new tech stack is going to come from that culture and is going to reflect a different set of needs and values and experiences from the maybe the kind of classic let's sell to developers and ultimately get inside the data center model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is such an interesting takeaway, and I have seen the same pattern, and those are exactly the people also who are typically quite data-driven. They really want to work with designers and be product-led and like use product analytics and understand how their sort of users are interacting with their products and the end user experience. So quite relevant as a follow-up of John Cutler's talk earlier in the DevGuild today. But I want to wrap us up here by asking if you have any quick takeaways for bottom-up founders that are just setting off their journey. Over to Chris.
Yeah, I mean, like,
Easy question. Easy question.
Exactly. Like, what are the, doing bottom up? I think we were just talking about, sort of figuring out who the product and so on is for, right? And I think there's a lot of ways to think it into the product as well, right? So from the very beginning, we let open source projects use Netlify for free, right? And we have thousands of them, the largest ones in the world. And there's both Kubernetes on the back end and React and Vue on the front end and so on, right? Using Netlify. And we can see a lot from that usage as well. That actually helps us instruments a lot of what we should be focusing on, right? And we have some tons of open source projects there, right? And have worked with Apollo and a bunch of other fantastic companies out there, right? And it's super interesting. So if you can instrument your product to actually also use that to figure out early learnings to figure out what you want to do. Otherwise, I just think whether it's bottom up or top down, or you're selling shoes or whatever, make sure that you know where you want to go, but also that you have immediate goals, and then make sure that you're focusing on also getting value out for yourself on the process of getting there. Like, anyone I meet that's only motivated by the end goal, like you can say the pot of gold, right? They rarely make it. Right. I think it's super, super important to be focused on the process of getting to the goals, right? Making sure there's plenty of milestones that will indicate success along the way. And for God's sake, enjoy it.
Yeah, enjoy the ride. Amanda, quick takeaway?
I'll just reiterate, once you've designed and built a great product, think about that experience that you need to design too, because that's super key. What do you want people to do when they first see your product? What do you want them to do after that? And how can you design that so it's a wonderful experience and they can do that without someone telling them what to do?
Yeah, that's actually a perfect input into how to design good data for product analytics. So perfect. Over to you, Matt. Quick takeaway.
Good luck. Work hard. I mean, look, I think PLG is obviously here to stay. I guess my experience is I wish I had seen sooner that it may not be the whole story. And I think thinking about, you're not going to know all the answers up front, but thinking about what it looks like to have monetization and be open to the possibility that the monetization may not just be kind of the intuitive bottoms up motion that I think a lot of founders really start with. I think there's a lot of interesting opportunity in that space, and none of it replaces the need for a great product that people love. So start there, but maybe spend your, Friday evenings or Sunday mornings or whatever it is thinking about the other piece too.
Thank you, everyone, so much for giving up precious time for knowledge sharing with founders on their bottom-up journey, or anyone else learning why they should not do bottom-up, for example, maybe. But this was wonderful. Thank you all. Ciao.
Thanks, Steph.
Thanks.